Yes, welcome to the closing plenary of My Data 2020 online conference. This has been a great experience on different time zones, going around the clock, listening also interesting talks and also seeing the new connections coming together as the theme of the conference is radical collaboration for the new normal. So it's my, in a way, sad pleasure to be opening the closing plenary of this conference. I'm Antti Jogi Poikola from Finland. I'm vice chair of My Data Global and also co-leading the My Data Operators thematic group. And yes, so here I am sitting in Helsinki on my home sofa. I remember Juno Kempe opening the conference from his office in Australia. So this is, I think this captures quite well the sentiment of this conference. So My Data conferences has been traditionally held physically in Helsinki and once also in Estonia, and both over from Helsinki to Estonia. And this has been nice tradition. And I just went through and saw some of the older photos of the venues of previous years. But this time, I think it's the good part of the global pandemic is that it forces us to learn new tricks. So this trick of having a conference that actually gathers people from all over the world together online has made some significant changes. I think the one thing is that it's the most international conference in the history of My Data. So I don't know exactly how many people from how many countries we have had here in the conference, but my sentiment is that it's more than usually. So today in this closing plenary, I wish everybody to be active in the chat, in the Zoom chat. So I will be hosting this session where we have the main speaker is Anouk Ruhaak. She's Mozilla Fellow focusing on data governance and design issues around it. She researches and pilots data commons and data trusts on her daily work. And the governance theme, this has been rising like a rocket in the last year or two in the data communities, personal data communities. And my connection to Anouk Ruhaak's work and now also we got the chance to discuss over online conferences a couple of times. I found her work over last summer when I was doing research since, well, My Data Operators, as I said, I'm co-leading a thematic group in My Data Global. My Data Operators are building infrastructure for human-centered personal data management. And infrastructure is crucial part to make this world of data sharing better, but it's not enough. We need also governance. And I started to study all sorts of governance models like data trusts and data commons and finding all sorts of information. And I semi-accidentally passed by of conference recording of another online conference, Radical Exchange, where Anouk hosted a session about data trusts. And this is kind of also essential for our time, that you can revisit the conferences, and also My Data conference presentations are recorded and put online. So I found out this conference session and I assisted it with lots of interest. And then I was like, okay, I need to get in touch with Anouk because she knows something that I don't know. And I think our knowledges would be combined more than individually. And so I reached out to her and we also then invited her to the conference here in My Data Global. And I'm very, very pleased to give very soon stage for her. But right now I see already chat messages coming through. So I will be monitoring the chat, and after Anouk's talk, we will have a Q&A, and I will be presenting the questions from you, the audience. So be quite clear. It's okay to have kind of side chat and discussions, but if you want to ask a question, just put very clearly question or something like that, so that I know, and I can then present those after the talk. So Anouk has been observing the sessions over the conference, and of course, nobody can visit all the sessions in all different time zones, but she has been going to some of the plenaries and some of the breakout sessions, kind of cherry picking according to her interests, and sensing and sense making what are the important themes and recurring themes and sentiments of this conference. So we have had these closing talks, and it's always a huge challenge for anybody to try to capture what has happened in this kind of conference over several days. But I believe we will have very good presentations, and also looking for the future. So stage is yours, Anouk Ruhaak. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being here, because I'm sure you're all very exhausted from 3 days of conferencing. Let me actually present and not just show you a half slide. There we go. Yes, my talk for today focuses on the idea of collaboration and the notion that we're all in this together. And I've been so excited to see all the talks and be part of all the sessions, because the main thing I realized, I think, while watching them all is how far we as a community, and I don't just mean my data community, but anyone working on topics of data, of privacy, of ethics in AI, how far the conversation has come, which took me back to sort of how it all started. And this is also reflects a little bit how I started in it. But it was very much, our conversations were very much focused on very individual notions of privacy, individual notions of control, the idea that we sort of can consent our way out of collective harms of data, that really the locus of control is the individual. And obviously, we've also seen that reflected in the GDPR and other data protection laws. And I and a lot of people like me have been sort of trying to broaden the scope of the conversation. And I think this year has, and that's my how it's going slide, this year has really brought that message home, because if anything, we've learned this year that we are all incredibly connected, and that my decision to leave the house also impacts your ability to leave the house in the future. It increases perhaps your risk of getting COVID, et cetera, et cetera. And so this notion of, hey, we don't exist in a vacuum, and decisions we make about data that is strictly speaking just about us could still affect other people. And that message has been reflected in so many talks and during so many sessions. First of all, just the my data operators on their own already reflect this notion that if we hold data each individually, it will not do a whole lot of good. But actually, if we pool it and we make it available collectively, obviously with the appropriate controls, we might be able to use it for public good. So that's, of course, the first step. But also what we've seen is people like Primavera talking about data as a social, like a social relations, where it's more about the interpersonal rather than the personal, and where it starts to become more, where you start to see that maybe if I never share any data, but all my friends do, that may still impact me greatly. She also mentioned data as infrastructure, as a fundamental resource that we need to train AI, and that is therefore more than just something that is about each of us individually. We've also seen a wide range of collective harms described that come about due to biased collection of data, biased use of data. I won't go into the many details because this is an entire field on its own. But Catherine introduced us to the idea of data feminism. We have had a session on data stewards, and what all of these kind of had in common is a notion of we need to do more than just giving individuals control, and we need to go beyond the technology and look for governance models and ways of governing this data that allow us all to do so democratically. But as also noted by Kalia, governance is hard and governance is messy. And so this shiny problem of what seems to be like, oh, we need some governance, like we could just sprinkle that on top of everything else and our problems will be solved, actually turns out to be quite a messy thing. One of the last things I wanted to say is that this notion of it's probably not a great idea to have individuals make all the decisions just for themselves is also increasingly reflected in policy proposals, as we saw also in the session on the European Data Governance Act, which I will come back to at the end. But yeah, so there really is a lot of focus on the need for governance. But what also struck me is while we are talking a lot about the need for it and the importance of it, and the importance of addressing the collective harms of data sharing, when I look at the models that are being implemented, a lot of them still focus on the ability for individuals to have their data in pods and then make strict decisions about their data as like the main governance model. And I'm sure that's not because that's the only thing we can come up with. But as I said, governance is hard. So what I wanted to do here is kind of start moving in the direction of, okay, what may other models look like? And what are some things we can start testing out as we leave this conference, basically. Yeah, so those would be kind of the first steps towards collective decision making about data, as well as creating the kind of powerful groups that can collectively bargain for their rights to have their data used in the way that they want to have it used. And what I found interesting, I was attending a session on citizen data or data for citizens, and in it someone said that that it's interesting that people share data with Facebook and Twitter and all the other social media all the time, but when local governments ask them to share data, they often say no. And for me, that really goes to this like power dynamic or the power imbalance that even when we sort of superficially have the decision to not share data, if we want to have access to these platforms, we often do anyways. We sort of, because there's no option where you can share some things and not others. So we just kind of blindly opt in. But then when a local government who we may actually want to make a data available to asks us nicely and makes it very easy for us to opt out, we almost immediately just like, no, I don't want to share any data, which sort of reflects both our actual interests as well as the inability to do that in other contexts. And so for me, what's important is that instead of putting that on one person, that we start collectively standing up and saying, no, this is not how we want to do things. But we do want to do this with our data. We do want to make it available to public good. Okay, so, oh, there we go. Yeah, as we have also seen in various sessions, there are many data governance models, and that would, like, if I were to explain them all to you, we would be here forever. And I'm sure you want to start your weekends, but like there's numerous, and I feel like every day we come up with a new word to describe a sort of a similar thing. Just looking at my own slide, I noticed that I forgot data unions in here, and I probably forgot many others as well. But I'm gonna really crudely generalize. What they all have in common is that it's a whole bunch of people coming together and collectively decide who they want to make data available to, under what conditions, for what purpose, duration, etc. With one variation, which mostly looks like this. I'm very sorry for my terrible drawing. But basically, it's a big group of people coming together, not wanting to make all the decisions collectively, because in some cases that would require millions of us to come together and, you know, negotiate until we all agree on something. So we may elect a board to represent us, or people in general to represent us, and to act on our behalf, which is here indicated in the tiny circle that sort of acts then as an intermediary between those organizations and the people who have come together to share data. Again, this is incredibly generalized, but I think it's sort of does the job of telling you what is supposed to happen. The question that's not answered by these two graphs, I mean, there's many questions that are not answered by these two graphs, but the one question that I care about is how are these people making decisions? So either when they're all in their big bowl together, or when they elect a governance or like a board, how are they coming to a decision? Yeah, what are the different models for that? And I think this is where it starts to get a bit more concrete. So this blurry concept of we need governance starts to become a little bit more real world. And I think the one that we are almost familiar with within the data context is individual consent. So in that case, the idea is we all have everyone makes decisions about the data that describes them. And we hope and pray that if everyone makes those decisions individually, that the collective outcome will be a good one. However, as we have seen again, that's definitely not always the case. And so we may start looking at different ways of making those decisions. Another one would be direct voting. So that corresponds largely with the one large circle of people. And in that model, they would all just have one vote, or you could go for some sort of different voting system, but they would all directly vote on decisions. So this is very much like a referendum. And there's lots of tools to do that. There's lots of apps that allow you to do this with people online. But yeah, so that's one model. I think one that we're all also quite familiar with is the one of elected representation, where groups of people decide who they want to have to represent them. And that can take sort of two forms. I mean, it can take many forms, but it can take two forms in one way, in the sense that you can have people make decisions on your behalf, or you can still leave a lot of the decisions with the individuals, but then have a group of people execute those decisions on their behalf. And you can obviously have both as well. And so with the operators, what we're seeing, I think, is that they are mostly the execution of the decisions rather than the deciding factor as well. And you could, for instance, combine direct voting with elected representation. Another model that I heard Kalia mention as well are the data juries or citizen juries, specifically for data. And I will explain that model a bit more, because I think it's not the most well-known one. So in citizen juries, what happens is basically if you have a whole population of people that have pooled their data or that have come together in a collective, like a commons or a cooperative, and you don't want to have a situation where all the decisions are made through direct voting or through or where one board makes all the decisions, or where the entire group constantly needs to reach consensus. You can instead opt for another option, which is you randomly select a number of people from that population that are representative. So you have all the minorities are represented, etc. And those people for a given duration of time, and this can really vary from 1 week to sometimes it's months. These people come together and they receive all the information they need. They can ask for more information if they need it. And that could be information about the decision they need to make. It could be, any kind of background information that they don't yet know. They can ask for people to come in and educate them about specific topics. And so that on its own can take quite a bit of time. And then from there, they will start deliberating on what they think the right outcome is. So for instance, in the case of, let's say, data commons, it could be that a researcher asks for permission to the data. this may be a completely novel case. They may never have had a researcher of this type ask for permission. And so the data comes like, okay, let's set up a jury to deliberate whether this is something we want to do generally as a rule. And then the jury comes back, and there's kind of multiple options here. Either their decision or their recommendations are really just viewed as recommendations, or it could be more of whatever they have decided is now what we're going to do. And obviously, these things need to be decided beforehand. For citizen juries to really work, it requires a large investment in capacity, because it basically means people need to spend their time, and we cannot just assume that everyone has the time or has the money to not work for that much time. So that is that's an investment right there, and then it's a investment in training, and yeah, that kind of capacity building. Personally, I think one of the benefits of this model would be that you slowly but surely start to create a more kind of aware citizenry, because people have actively grappled with the issues rather than sort of passively clicked yes or no on a consent form. So yeah, that's one model, and it's currently being explored by the Ada Lovelace Institute in London, which are, and they are doing a lot of work on data governance and privacy, and they are exploring this with the National Health Services in the UK, together with the Wellcome Trust. So they're really setting this up and seeing how it works. Another model, which sort of combines a couple of the decision-making models I mentioned before. This is very much not my graph. It's from the coda.io. And it's also not to do with data, but I think it's an excellent illustration, so I wanted to use it anyway. But it's the community land trust. And in a community land trust, so very, very brief description, but I don't think we all need to become experts in community land trust. But basically what happens is you have a piece of land with buildings on it and community members on it. And instead of everyone who owns a building holding part of that land, the rights to that land are put in a trust. And those are then managed on behalf of the people who live on the land. Usually with the purpose of keeping housing on that land, housing prices on that land very low. So this is very much to create affordable housing in perpetuity. I'm happy to talk more about community land trusts because they're super fascinating. But to keep it more to the relevant parts, the way community land trusts are governed is, I think, very interesting and very relevant for how we may come to govern our data. Basically, the community land trusts, the decisions about the land are made through a board, and those boards, actually 3 boards, and one board is made up of community members. One of the board is made up of users and residents, so those would be the people actually living in the houses on the land. And then there's another board for local stakeholders and experts, and so those could be local politicians, anyone basically doing kind of policy work, or maybe helping fix the houses, or kind of that group of people. And so you have 3 very distinct interests, and for every category of communities, let's say, they get to vote their people onto the board. So it's very much representative. But because it's structured as 3 separate boards, you sort of ensure that that is not like, let me phrase this differently. If you would have one board, there's a real chance that, for instance, the local stakeholders and experts obtain a majority on the board and then start to outvote needs of the community members or the residents. And so by creating 3 boards, you guarantee that those people are always represented, regardless of who they vote onto the board. And this is also a model used in open source projects quite often, where you often have all sorts of different interests between people using a piece of software, building a piece of software, big companies investing in it, etc. And so I think we can start using this for data as well, where maybe even within a community. So even if we leave out the users of data and we just look at the community of people who the data is about, and or who want to collectively govern a set of environmental data, for instance, there's usually not just one interest. There's usually not just one sort of profile of person. There's usually multiple groups, and they may have very competing interests. So to ensure that they are continuously heard, we may set up some sort of governance system like this. Yeah, so far I have talked about all the various ways we can make decisions. What I've not yet talked about is how do we make sure that, let's say that citizen jury comes back with a decision, and we may have some sort of person in place who executes that decision. How do we ensure that that person continuously acts in the best interest of the people who have come together to govern the data or who the data is about? And one way to do that is through creation of fiduciary duties. So one of the other great things about the community land trust is that because it's a trust, the trustees have fiduciary duties. And what that means is, and they have two duties. One is the duty of loyalty, which means they can only act in the best interest of those that benefit from the trust. And the other one is the duty of care, which means they cannot be negligent. And so those things immediately come about when you create a trust, which is why the term data trust has been thrown around so often, because we can also do this with data. We can put data in a trust and then have any kind of governance system. Like the governance model is not, it doesn't depend much on the trust, but we would have these fiduciary duties built in. In other jurisdictions, we may have them through contract. Again, this is a whole different talk that I could give as well. The other two, and I've heard these discussed in various sessions as well, is like the need for transparency. So if people take decisions about data, and it can even be very day-to-day ones, it's like Facebook asked for data, we gave it this data on this date, that should be logged, and that log should be openly available so it can be inspected by civil society or anyone who cares really. Another one I find quite important is an interoperability safeguard, which means that you can always leave whatever governance system you're in and take your data or anything that belongs to you and put it somewhere else. That is still a bit risky because it does mean that some people may find it easier to move and may have more time to figure out where they should go than others. But yeah, when we build these systems, I think especially when the safeguards, like for instance with a My Data operator, the safeguard is very simple that your data sits in, they don't have access to the data. So the safeguard is kind of a technological one. But when you start moving beyond that, and when you start moving towards putting the data together and having these kind of collective decisions, other types of safeguards need to be put in place. Yeah, I've really come to the end of my talk, and I just wanted to discuss kind of like, okay, this is interesting, great. Where do we move from here? I think the first one is it's very, very tempting to set up all these like complicated governance models and regimes. But I think the first step is always talk to the people. Talk to the people who you are looking to have decisions made about ultimately. Figure out what they need. And there's so many ways to do that. There's so many online tools that allow you to survey people, to have lots of conversations ongoing and asynchronously. But that I think should always be the first step. On a more legal level, I hope governments start making it possible to have like some sort of regulatory sandboxes where we can start experimenting with new models without immediately getting fined for breaking the GDPR and other laws, which is right now a bit of an obstacle. And finally, and especially for Europeans, what you can do right now, if you're interested in these things, the European Commission has put out a proposal for a Data Governance Act. And that act really already starts to look at, okay, what could an intermediary look like? What kind of rules should be attached to it? And they open to consultation. They're looking for your input. And so you can do that. You can write your opinion to them and avoid having only the Googles and the Facebooks giving their opinion. So those are some of the next steps. There are definitely more, but I'm really sure you want to start the weekend. So that's it for me. Thank you. And I'm very eager to hear all your questions.
Thank you very much for the interesting talk. There were a couple of questions in the chat, and there I will be monitoring it if you still want to put more questions therein. So I will start with some that came over the chat and put a couple of my own questions also in.
Excellent.
So there was, I think this is in a way, looking from the My Data perspective, this community is very much starting around the idea of individuals having control over their own data, but it's already, I think for several years, it has been understood by My Data community quite widely that that's not enough. It's the starting point, and that starting point kind of switches the balance from the big tech corporates to people,
Right.
at least on the individual level. And then if individuals have some power and control, then the next would be to take also the collective approach. And also, we don't want to leave people alone with their data, and getting all the rights, and also at the same time the responsibilities, and needing to carry that alone. That would be not sustainable. So I think your talk is really timely on that way, how it attaches to the development of thinking and thoughts in the My Data community. So some questions from the chat. So we have seen basically what I heard is that you are describing sort of data democracy. So there are different mechanisms of people coming together and deciding about the data. But at the same time, we are living kind of crisis of democracy, and people are not so eager to participate, and all sorts of societal participation is going down. So, and I think that in each and every session or a plenary session, somebody has been questioning that, well, do people actually care, and do we envision, or do we rely on that that people would care about their data? So that question came again in this session in the chat. So is this kind of decision-making mechanism that you are exploring here dependent on people caring, and how do you see that question coming around in the future?
Right. Yeah, I think that's the question, really. Yes and no. Like, I think people care about certain types of data. Someone with a specific disease may care a lot about their health data and making sure that that data goes towards curing the disease or things like that, because it's super personal and very non-trivial. But you may care less about what Facebook does with your data, in part because you don't think you can influence the process, which I think is often the case. It's like this lack of felt agency, or in our case, actual agency. I think so. I think we need to build for that, and I think we need to build models for different levels of caring, which is why I don't think any of the decision-making models I discussed here, I don't think one is necessarily better than the other. I think it's one of those things where, if in situations where people care deeply, we may just go for sort of a consensus-based model. We may go for long deliberations between all the people and see what they think. But in situations where we expect the majority to not care deeply, or just not want to we don't want to be thinking about our data every day. Like, we have different things to do. There's more going on in life. And I think for those cases, the citizen juries are specifically well fitted, because it requires a small group of people to care deeply rather than all of us to care just enough.
Okay, other related question here is that, okay, in a way it's simple to put this individual approach. So at least people are separate individuals mostly in some sense. Of course, that's very cultural also. But then the question comes that if we want, as we should, have these more collective approaches as well. So in the digital world, the boundaries are not so clear. So in nation states, you have the citizenship, and then you get your rights to vote. And well, it's not perfect also in physical world, but in digital world, the groups and groupings are very dynamic, and people belong to here and there, and it may change from day to day and hour to hour. So who should be presented in these collectives?
So this is the question, honestly, that I've been breaking my head on for the last month or two, because it's the question. Like, it's one of those, like, where do we draw the boundaries of the community when we talk about community? Like, what even does that mean? I hope so one of the things I work on in relation to data commons and data trust is like making sure they have a specific purpose. Because usually when you start to see, like, okay, the purpose of this thing is to make data available to X or to solve this problem, at least you start to see, okay, these are the people who naturally fit in that group. And that can be self-selected. It can just be like, we want to create a data commons that allows households to make their data available for like environmental regulations, or for the government to understand how much water we're using, something like that. That's quite self-selecting. We start to see people who care about that, who just opt into that, and they know exactly like, okay, this is what I'm opting into. But I don't have a very good answer to this question. This is definitely one to be researched.
Yeah, then maybe something that comes from my own thinking here is, as I explained in the beginning, that how I started to be interested in the data governance models is coming from the infrastructure world, and more from the technological perspective, and there we in a way believe that also the technology, you made it clear also that technology can be made as some sort of one sort of safeguard.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
So there
multiple,
is,
actually. I just mentioned one. Sorry, I talked over you.
yeah. So basically, there is this kind of idea of code of law that technology enables and makes some things easier, and some things are impossible or very hard, and that's kind of governance. But that who decides what kind of technology is built, that needs governance. So that's kind of the angle where we are approaching then these governance models. And my question for you is that. Now, when this data governance thinking or discussion is rocket boosting up, so how and where you would see the beneficial collaborations between the more techies and then the more human and organizational governance thinkers like yourself?
Right. Yeah, honestly, almost anywhere. Like you point out, the design of the code and the design of the technologies we built is very much a social and political decision. And I think whenever it is, it should not just be the person writing the code making the decision. So in those cases, I think actively collaborating with, broadly speaking, civil society would be super helpful. Also, when standards are created, this is kind of a notorious problem in standard setting bodies. They are that they're mostly, well, first of all, they're mostly white men, mostly technologists, and mostly people with time. That's the other problem with governance, is that it takes time. Showing up for discussions, showing up for panels, showing up for anything takes time, and having time is a privilege. So yeah, so I think there is so much room for collaboration and for relationships across these fields, but we have to understand that the way time is allocated is not necessarily fair. And then there's a need to, whenever those decisions require a lot of technology and technical skill, we also need to allow for that, or actually maybe make the decisions. I think what I want to say is like, so often we start only talking about the social political implications of technology when it's already half underway. And what I actually would like is for people, people like me, but also specifically the people who are going to be quote unquote governed by that technology, to come in at the beginning of the conversation before a line of code has been written, to actually start to understand, oh, how is this going to impact different people? And even with that, we won't get it right. We will still do all sorts of things wrong. But at least we have multiple voices in the room before we start designing, which right now is often not the case.
Mm. Yeah, I remember hearing in one of the sessions here this quote, no, not do things about us or for us without us. So
exactly.
So
Yeah,
that's
it.
kind of a typical caveat that some technologists want to make world better place for some groups, but then it
I
comes
have no
too
idea where those
complicated to
people are.
include those groups, and then the solution might not be so good. So yeah, maybe getting closer to end of this Q&A, I see there was one more question coming from the chat regarding the community land trusts. So I think it's super good to get inspirations from other parts of the not so digital world. But the question goes that are any community land trusts actually organizing to use personal data to govern themselves, as you described, or was this just a framework
Just
as
an
a model
example.
to think?
Yeah. No,
So
I mean, they hold data, so essentially they are making decisions about data, but very indirectly. They're focused on length. I saw one more thing in the chat that I just wanted to comment on, which has to do with, which is Andre saying, I think there's a future or even a market for trusted, vetted, proven opt-in schemas, which are outcome of certain interest groups. And then there's more text, and I leave it to you to read that. But I would just, yeah, I saw it and I thought it was interesting. I've been playing around with the notion of what we've been calling a consent champion, which would essentially be this. It would basically be NGOs on different topics. So not necessarily data NGOs, but it could be if you want to make data available about environmental things, it could be environmental agencies and or human rights agencies who have a deep understanding of all the ways in which this may go wrong, for them to be like, hey, we advise to share this and not this, and in this way and not in that way, and then for people to just opt into that. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I think that's good point also to kind of think in new way that there could be some sort of algorithmic representation or maybe some preferences that are coded, whether being individual or collective preferences,
Right.
so that we can in a way overcome the mental barrier that when we think of governance, that it should me putting a vote on and dropping it a poll and going once
Right.
in a year somewhere. So it can be something completely different, which might not be so burdensome, but however, it still needs to have the governance structures to for the decision making and design. So after then it could work more automatically over time. So I think this will be the end of our discussion here now, and I must thank you very much for your talk and for your observations of the conference, and we warmly welcome all the data governance people to lurk and come and enjoy also the My Data community and the vice versa. We have this in My Data Global, in our strategy, there is actually one box that is one of my favorites, is this friends organizations. So I think in the same way, like people might be friends with other people, the organizations can be friends with other organizations, and friendship is always mutual. So it's not like, oh, come here and come with us, but then we have to go and come with you as well. If one friend always invites other people to go to the movies and nobody goes with them, they find other friends. So kind of this mutual friendship with different communities and organizations, and this has been also the theme of the conference is the radical collaboration. So I think this kind of collaborations I hope to see more on next year, and I commit myself at least to be included and involved in the data governance discussions more. So with these words, I thank you very much,
Thank you
Anouk,
so much for
and
having me.